What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. Hope everyone's having a great weekend. I am back to discuss one of my lifelong obsessions, the fantasy genre, and what we can look forward to in the future now that Game of Thrones is just about over. Irrespective of the latest mixed reaction to the final season of Game of Thrones, the fantasy genre is seriously heating up right now in the world of television, with Amazon Studios making their own moves on this front with several potentially major franchises, while HBO is working hard on a Game of Thrones prequel, along with some other possible spinoffs from that franchise. So I thought it'd be fun just to bring everybody up to speed on what we can look forward to seeing down the road, while also making a few suggestions at the end of the video for series that I think would be ideal candidates as potential movies or shows in the future. So because of the depth and complexity of all these stories I'll be discussing their individual plots exclusively in broad strokes, but rest assured, I'll be revisiting all these tales and doing the appropriate deep dives as we get closer to the release date of these shows. So let's start with the giant elephant in the room, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. Pound for pound, this is one of the longest and, more importantly, one of the most beloved fantasy series ever conceived by a human being. Jordan's world is one where the use of magic by men has been tainted, causing inevitable madness over time, meaning that the hero of our story, Randall Thor, could potentially end up becoming an even worse threat to humanity than the Dark One that he wishes to defeat. This vast, sprawling epic features an enormous cast of memorable characters, all of whom play major roles in their own way in making this giant tapestry irresistible to fantasy fans. The series consists of 11 original novels as well as a prequel written by Robert Jordan, followed by 3 novels co-written by Brandon Sanderson, who stepped in and finished the series using notes and chapters already written by Robert Jordan prior to his death. From what I've read online, this series so far has sold 80 million books worldwide, so clearly there's a giant built-in fan base who would be seriously invested in a great adaptation. I read the first 6 books back in the 1990s, absolutely fell in love with them, and you can see my original beat-up copies from back in the day right here over my left shoulder, still very proudly displayed. And then about a decade later, I reread those books when I decided to dive back in and read up through Knife of Dreams, which is book 11, which is where the series stood at that time. But with this show now on the horizon, I've decided to pick up the remaining 3 books co-written by Brandon Sanderson, which I'm going to dig into later this summer. But as far as this community is concerned, I'm a total lightweight. Most hardcore fans have read all 14 books several times over, and these are not slender novellas. 1,000 pages, give or take, is the customary length per entry, so if the show were to take off, Amazon would have the luxury of having all this material to work with for many years to come without running the risk of running out of original story, as was the case with Game of Thrones, a factor that has become something of an Achilles heel for that show. So far, there's no release date for the first season of The Wheel of Time. Filming won't even start until September of this year, with writer and producer Rafe Judkins acting as the showrunner. Rafe's previous work includes Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as well as Hemlock Grove, and I can only imagine how challenging it is to try and adapt such an intricate story, or finding the right actors who, if the show is a hit, could easily end up playing these characters for a decade or more. That's a massive commitment, and obviously would get more and more expensive over time. Fans of the series will know what I'm talking about, but if they can just make it as far as the Battle of Dumais Wells at the end of Lord of Chaos, and more importantly, get it right, it could be the most epic event in the history of the fantasy genre ever caught on film. It would completely, totally put the Red Wedding to shame, but if you don't know the story, I'll simply say, pick up The Eye of the World, you will fall right into it, and you might not come up for air for a very long time. So right now, I think this is the most exciting show in development in the fantasy genre. But The Wheel of Time is not the only major fantasy series Amazon's currently working on. They have a little project on the side you might have heard of called The Lord of the Rings. Although I should specify up front, this is not a fresh adaptation of the 3 novels adapted by Peter Jackson back in the early 2000s. When it comes to the 3 novels that make up The Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King, that story famously takes place at the end of J.R.R. Tolkien's Third Age, while this new show will initially focus on the events that take place in the Second Age. If you like Jackson's trilogy, you've already had a very small taste of the Second Age with the battle scene at the opening of Fellowship of the Ring, when the last alliance of elves and men besieged Barad-dûr, where Isildur lopped the One Ring off Sauron's hand. That event effectively brought the Second Age to a close. Sadly, Tolkien didn't write about this period in exhaustive detail. However, there's some extraordinary passages toward the end of the Silmarillion, as well as in the appendices at the end of Return of the King, that give us an idea of what we might see. Specifically, the forging of the Rings of Power, as well as the fall of Numenor. These are some of the most crucial events in the history of Middle-earth, and fingers crossed, the show will occasionally choose to have flashbacks from the First Age. The book The Silmarillion is primarily concerned with the First Age, and includes some of my favorite passages in the history of fantasy fiction. And if you consider yourself a fantasy fan, you haven't lived until you've soaked in the grandeur grandeur of the Silmarillion several times over. But when it comes to the show, what's great about the Second Age is how these tales give us a chance to see Sauron in action in humanoid form interacting with other characters. This could be the role of the century for whoever's cast. And my understanding is that Amazon spent $250 million just on the rights to Tolkien's material, and they're spending yet another $250 million on the production of the first 2 seasons of this show, with tentative plans for another 3. Now, when it comes to the budget of the first 2 seasons, I've seen conflicting reports on that front, whether or not the $250 million is for the first 2 seasons or for possibly all 5. But clearly, Amazon's going all in on this franchise, playing a very long game. And I have to say, their heart already seems to be in the right place. They had this beautiful tease on Twitter a little while back with a quote by Tolkien, followed by a map of Middle-earth. What makes Tolkien's world so special, apart from the wonderful characters, is the care and attention that he put into creating his maps, creating all the various languages, creating all the various histories. It's what gives the world such enormous depth and complexity. Sadly, we probably won't see the first episode until 2021, but when it comes to Tolkien, I much prefer that Amazon takes their time and gets this right. And as if Amazon did not already have enough fantasy projects underway, they're taking a fresh crack at Stephen King's Dark Tower series, totally independent from the feature film that came out a couple years ago. Right now, they're only working on the pilot, which will be based on Roland's early days, the stories that fans first read about in the brilliant flashback section of the 4th book in the series, Wizard and Glass. In my opinion, that is some of the strongest work of King's career, and I'd kill to see that novel adapted properly. Handling the showrunner duties will be Glenn Mazzara, who produced the 2nd and 3rd seasons of Walking Dead, but I'm not letting myself get too excited until I hear that this show has officially been given the green light beyond the pilot. That said, if they get it right, and I get to enjoy an eventual adaptation of Drawing of the Three, my favorite book in the series, I'll be one happy Stephen King freak. So only a few weeks ago, this next project would have likely sparked quite a different reaction, but we can't avoid talking about the Game of Thrones prequel that for now is going with the title, The Long Night, admittedly a title that now makes many unhappy fans scream in protest. Game of Thrones has changed from the most popular show in the world to one of the most divisive, with people taking aim at the 8th season for every reason imaginable. I'm still having fun with it, but I totally concede that season 8 has tons of problems. HBO has hinted that they have a variety of Game of Thrones spin-offs in development, but what we know for sure for now is that later this year, a new show that takes place during the Age of Heroes, thousands of years before the existing show, will go into production. In his books, J.R.R. Martin has written barely more than a few scraps about the Age of Heroes, but the show itself will be written by Jane Goldman, a screenwriter who adapted Kick-Ass, as well as Kingsman: The Secret Service for Matthew Vaughn, 2 movies that I really enjoyed. I'm sure some will find it a relief to hear that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are not involved, but no matter what one thinks about Season 8 of Game of Thrones, the eternal optimist in me loves the idea that HBO is sticking with the fantasy genre and continuing to develop more material, at least for the foreseeable future. So now's the time for a little wishful thinking, and I'd like to make 2 suggestions, the first of which apparently came close to being a show a few years ago. But even if these books never get adapted, if even one of you out there ends up reading these books and having a good time, I'll consider the time making this video to be well spent. When it comes to fiction, at least, the 21st century has been an insanely rich period for the genre overall, and I keep discovering incredible new series thanks to the recommendations of the very active fan community. But this first one I want to give a shout out to is called Malazan Book of the Fallen, a 10-book series by Steven Erikson that has a ton of spin-offs written by Ian Cameron Esselmont. Apparently the 2 authors co-created this world back in the 1980s as a backdrop to one of their tabletop RPG campaigns. As someone who spent half their life playing D&D, that automatically makes me a fan of these 2 guys. But I should admit I've not finished this series. I'm reading the 3rd book right now, Memories of Ice, and I'm absolutely loving it. And in broad strokes, the story follows an era of warring empires with powerful godlike entities playing active roles, totally unafraid to get their hands dirty in the day-to-day affairs of mere mortals. And I should say I have as much fun watching this cast of characters in action as I did when I first discovered Greek mythology and Marvel Comics as a young kid. This is not a series grounded in gritty medieval realism. This is a series where the fantasy elements are absolutely allowed to soar. Probably the most notable attribute is the world building and the level of detail. They're absolutely first rate. But I should offer one word of caution. These are very dense books that hurl a ton of information at the reader from the word go. Most fantasy books start out as a little trickling stream, and then slowly over time they grow into a raging river, which allows you to get to know the terminology and the characters in kind of a slow, organic fashion. But when it comes to the first book of this series, Gardens of the Moon, it felt kind of like a fire hose being inserted right into my mouth, and I frequently had to use reference guides just to understand what the hell was happening. I've been trying to think of a fair comparison for this series, and the only thing that really comes to mind is actually the Dark Souls franchise in video games, where players really need to step up their game and make a huge effort in order to have a great experience. But as is the case with Dark Souls, the juice is very much worth the squeeze. And if you've already read The Wheel of Time 10 times over and need new challenges, Malazan Book of the Fallen is calling your name. Now, this last suggestion will likely never be a show on the scale that it deserves, because while the fan base is incredibly passionate, the fan base is also incredibly small, and to do this show right, the budget would be prodigiously expensive. That's one of the advantages of writing fantasy as opposed to shooting fantasy. But I'm talking about the work of author R. Scott Bakker, whose utterly unique fantasy tale begins with the Prince of Nothing trilogy, which you can actually see over my right shoulder right here. And then the story continues with a quartet called The Aspect Emperor. 2 more books apparently are on their way, although no release date has been set. But of all the fantasy series that I've read in my life, going from the days of reading Dragonlance as a little kid up to the present day, this series actually comes closest to my perfect ideal of what a fantasy series should be if the authors were in the mood to take personal requests from their readers. But with that in mind, I should caution that this story is not for the faint of heart. This series has the darkest heart of any fantasy series I've ever encountered, with so many depraved scenarios that explore the deepest, darkest depths of the human soul. And that's a rare quality in epic fantasy, which historically tends to be more stately and more wholesome, kind of like the world created by J.R.R. Tolkien. So if you love fantasy and have a taste for a little stronger medicine when it comes to boundary-pushing, transgressive material, these books will absolutely blow your mind. I would be shocked and amazed if anyone ever considered taking a crack at adapting these books for film or television, but they get my highest possible recommendation. Now, before I draw this to a close, I should give a shout out to 2 other series just because they had such a huge impact on me as a little kid, but I haven't read them in years. But back during the great heyday of Dungeons & Dragons, they had these campaign settings, and one of the ways they would flesh out these campaign settings was by having a series of novels to kind of provide the backdrop so the world would feel lived and breathed in when you started inserting your own characters and stories into it. And the 2 biggest ones that I read as a kid were both Dragonlance as well as Forgotten Realms. But both Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms have dozens of novels, and not all of them are created equal. But the essential books that form the spine of those worlds, they gave me so much pleasure and so much delight as a kid. And I still find myself thinking about characters like Raistlin on almost a daily basis several decades later. And I would need to revisit those series to see how well they hold up. But I cannot overemphasize just how important those books were to me from like age 11 through about 18. At any rate, I think it's time to wrap this video up, but I hope you've enjoyed this little rant about the fantasy genre. Not since the days of the early 80s have we seen a time where so many different fantasy projects are in development. It's made me want to redouble my efforts in terms of discovering new series that I haven't read yet, and there's a long list of books out there that are still on my to-do list that I plan on getting to. So if you have any great recommendations on that front, please do so in the comments below or give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax. You can pretty much find me there anytime. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate it. But thanks as always for the support for my channel, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.